Namaskar, everyone. Welcome to the Harvard India Conference, and welcome to this panel on big bets in the Indian manufacturing sector over the next 10 years. As is widely known, this topic is immensely important and urgent. Given a number of domestic and global trends, it's a race against time to grow India's industrial sector and to thereby achieve accelerated and broad-based growth of our economy. Given this context, we are incredibly fortunate to share this virtual room with a truly distinguished panel and to hear and learn from them about this critical topic. So please join me in sending a very warm virtual welcome to our esteemed panelists, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian ji, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Vani Kola ji, Managing Director, Kalari Capital, Gautam Kumra ji, Managing Partner, McKinsey, India, Dr. Rana Hassan ji, Director, Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, Asian Development Bank, and Dr. Lata Venkatesh ji, Executive Editor of CNBC TV 18. We are truly lucky to have Lata ji as the moderator for the panel as well. Before handing the mic to Lata ji, I'd like to quickly outline the session. The session will commence with 15 minutes of opening remarks from the moderator and all panelists. This will be followed by 30 minutes of panel discussion facilitated by the moderator. Then in the final 15 minutes, the moderator will bring up aggregated questions from the audience. So audience members, please do use the Q&A function that you see on your screen to post your questions. Also, please make use of the upvote or like function in the Q&A window. Questions that are upvoted the most will appear at the top of the list. And finally, please do tag us with the hashtag ICH2021 when tweeting your favorite quotes, insights, and moments from the panel. So now, without any further ado, requesting Lata ji to kindly commence the panel.
Thank you very much, Gopal. It's really a distinguished panel, and I wouldn't want to waste any time introducing them. Vani Kola, well known for backing so many startups, and not very often we have so many women in that position. Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian must be ranking as one of the youngest chief economic advisors, of course, professor of finance at Indian School of Business before that. Mr. Gautam Kumra, of managing partner at McKinsey, must have advised ever so many companies to manufacturing. And Rana Hassan, we're going to depend a lot on you. He's the Director, Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, Asian Development Bank, would know perhaps more than any of us about the comparative strengths of various Asian and ASEAN countries in attracting manufacturing. That quite clearly is leaving China. So there are 2 or 3 reasons why this session is very important. India has declared its intent to increase the quantum or the share of manufacturing in GDP to 25% by 2025 for a growing young population. This is needed, obviously, to create more jobs, but also for self-reliance, which has now become important not just as national policy, but as a geopolitical necessity because of tariffs going up and the contentious geopolitical environment that we are in. So both for international reasons and for national employment reasons, we need to up the ante on manufacturing. It's the declared policy of the Government of India and production-linked incentives policy that is reasonably well known. So I will request Dr. Subramanian to start the proceedings because the policy has been laid. He would be best placed to elucidate it. And then I'll go to someone who is holding the fort for youngsters, Vani Kola. And then I'll go to Gautam Kumra and Rana Hassan in that order. So Dr. Subramanian, if you can first lay what's the government's priorities, and we will take it from there. I think you have to unmute yourself, sir.
Thank you very much, Lata, and a very good morning to all the students and participants in the United States, and good evening to those here in India. So firstly, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. This is just, I think, the right time to talk about manufacturing, especially given what we've seen in the budget. So let me give you my big picture thoughts on, on the focus that we have placed on manufacturing. In the 2018-19 economic survey, we had laid out, if you look at countries over the last century, those that have grown at 5% plus for at least a decade, those have grown, through a virtuous cycle that starts from private investment. Now, when you put that together with the fact that in India, given our, the huge demographic dividend, to convert it actually into a dividend, I think we need jobs in the organized sector. And that's why if you look at the several reforms that have been done over the last 2 years, the emphasis of that has been on the primary sector and the secondary sector. Secondary sector, we need to absorb a lot more people from the primary sector. Secondary is basically manufacturing, primary agriculture, and therefore job creation in the manufacturing sector becomes extremely critical. I think that's sort of the one key aspect, because if you think about overall, and I think the United States is an excellent example, the New Deal and the growth that happened, the burgeoning middle class that was created after the Great Depression happened because of huge number of jobs that were created in manufacturing. Cities like Detroit really grew on that basis, something that India needs to do as well. So I think jobs in manufacturing are extremely important to push aggregate demand and thereby generate sustained growth for us. Now, if from that perspective, if you look at what are the reforms that we've done, and I'll just quickly highlight some of the key problems. One of the key problems, and this is something that we had highlighted in the 2018-19 survey, also was the problem of dwarfism in the Indian manufacturing sector. The fact that our firms would basically age but would not grow and thereby would not create jobs. I think the MSME definitional changes that we've done now and the PLI scheme that Lata was mentioning are actually conditioned on trying to remove that particular obstacle, make growth, an important part of the incentive scheme so that these firms can grow and thereby create jobs in the process. I think together with that, if you look at the labor reforms, in 1991, back when I was actually in college, when IMF gave its loan to India, at that time, the conditionality had labor market reforms, and it has taken us 30 years effectively to actually implement that. The significant rationalization, from about more than 40 odd labor laws to actually just 4, many sections, number of sections reduced by 2/3, compliance is reduced. I think it's seminal in pushing manufacturing. Together with, I think, this particular budget, the focus on public capex, public capital expenditure, I think is also important, because that can really trigger, private capital expenditure and thereby really, push. So if you look at the collective reform agenda, it is primarily to push manufacturing growth, create more jobs in the organized manufacturing sector, and thereby really create sustained growth in the Indian economy. I think we can go into the details, but I thought that would be a good big picture, setup for us to actually lead into the discussion.
Okay, point taken. Thank you, Dr. Subramanian. Vani, from a startup angle, is there any initial points you want to make? You're open to make other points as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Lata. And thank you for all the organizers here. And of course, good morning to all the students here. And lovely to be with everyone on this discussion. Firstly, it's great to see that we are having this discussion on manufacturing. I can't remember in the last 5 years having this discussion with anyone. So it's in the spotlight. And I think it comes from some of the budget reforms. So while we all know that there has always been an unrealized promise of in the manufacturing sector, especially in the context of the large population like India and how manufacturing is elemental in job creation. I think those have always been there in the last 20 years, but we have been stagnant at around 14-15% in the economy. And could the budget reform right now to push this to 25% by 2025, can that be realized, right? Is this the moment? Those are really the big question. And from my vantage point of view, being at a venture capital firm and not being at a policy or research advantage, I look at it from the lens of not much venture capital investment has gone into this. Yes, many global companies have now announced or have started manufacturing operations in India, Amazon with Fire Stick and Foxconn, commitment to invest $1 billion producing iPhones in India, Tesla's recent announcement, and many others, right? So the question is, can we now create a vibrant local manufacturing culture? Can risk capital like PEVC participate in accelerating this? Do we finally have the right policy structure to capture this opportunity? These are sort of the questions that I mull over and think about. And for that, I think discussion around why didn't it happen? Why didn't manufacturing really take off in India's past? I think is important to discuss. And what edge do we have today? And is this the moment, right? And those I'm sure we'll discuss as we go along. But I think I come to this, Lata, from the lens of, could my industry, could firms like Kalari or people like me play a role in this sector and contribute?
Gautam, you must be advising a lot of firms, which probably because of the China +1 policy or because they want to enter India, would be asking your advice. What is the most important problem?
Sure. Thank you again for inviting me. I think if Lata, I could make maybe 3 comments, one on the opportunity, second on the complication, and third on what needs to happen. You see the opportunity, I think Dr. Subramanian alluded to it very clearly. If you look at over the next decade, India needs to produce about 90 million jobs and needs to grow at about 8 to 8.5% to keep our unemployment in check. Manufacturing has the potential to add about 20% of the incremental GDP between now and 2030, and roughly 10% of those 90 million jobs over the next decade. So that's the big potential. I think the complication in the story is that we've been talking about this for quite some time. If you look at over 2000 to 2020, the manufacturing GDP has only inched up from about 15.2 to 17.2. And the real issue in my mind is one of competitiveness. If you take something like electronics, and the reality is if you benchmark India with Vietnam, we have about a 10 to 15% cost disadvantage on electronics manufacturing. And it's not a surprise that more than 90% of the electronics components that are used in India are still imported from other markets. And it's not a surprise, therefore, that countries like Vietnam have taken a real march over India, and their manufacturing GDP in this time has doubled from about 11% to about 24% of GDP. So the question is, what do we need to do? What do we need to do? And I think I'll just make 3-4 quick comments. I think number one, I think we have to focus. We have to focus on a couple of globally competitive value chains. For example, I think you'll take auto components. We are damn competitive. We have to scale that. Similarly, take food processing. I think we are competitive in some parts, but that needs a transformation. And then finally, I think we have to enter some high technology niches like semiconductors and fabs. So that's point number one, focus. Point number two, I think we need to have a long-term sustainable and declining tariff regime. I think if you look back in time, I think a declining tariff regime actually has driven export growth as a percentage of GDP. Number three, I would say we have to see, I'm very excited about the PLI incentives. I think we just need to see speedy, effective execution of this across all the 10, 12 sectors. Number four, I think we need to see the development of what I call port proximate manufacturing clusters. And number five, I think we need to scale companies. India has 600 large companies. We need to triple that. And that requires a whole agenda. I can talk about that later, but let me stop at that.
1 minute. Got that. Rana, your vantage point is, how India compares with other ASEAN countries or South Asian countries better than most of us, most others. Now, I'm referring to a Nomura report which studied 56 companies leaving China between April 2018 and August 2019. 15 months they studied 56 countries. Of that, 26 went to Vietnam, and only about 3 came to India. 11 went to Thailand, and there were some Philippines that got 8, but India got 3. Now, you're in a position where you can detect what is making Vietnam more attractive over India.
Lata, so that's an excellent question, and let me just step back a little. As there's a recent paper with a very catchy title, "Who's Going to Fill China's Shoes?" And
Yes.
so that's both literally and figuratively. And we see China vacating. So for example, in electronics, in 2019, it has about 27% global share. Now, this actually is a 2 percentage point reduction over the last 5 years. Apparel, even larger. Today, say 2019, it's about 33% of world exports. That's been a reduction of 4%. And as you pointed out, we see certainly in apparel, it's Vietnam, it's actually Bangladesh, which are gaining share. India actually has lost share in the case of apparels. It's gained a little bit in electronics, but we're hardly there. I think it's a little less than half a percentage point actually. So it's a great question. There is an opportunity. But I just want to make this point that it's not just an issue of the other countries coming up, places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, elsewhere in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world. There's also China to contend with, because a lot of the production, a lot of the exports is basically on the Eastern Seaboard side. Now, for a long time, China has been attempting to move production west. It's been difficult. And one of the reasons is manufacturing is something which really benefits from agglomeration economies. It really pays to have a concentrated set of your entire supply chain close by. It pays to be close to ports, etc. But we know that China is actually investing. It's been investing a lot in great infrastructure, high-speed rail, freight, you name it. So I think India is absolutely on the right track. Dr. Subramanian mentioned several things, I think, on infrastructure, the drive that's been there for the last decade and a half. We're seeing acceleration. We're seeing really some major labor reforms. I would say that when you think about, across the board, so let's not get into sector specific stuff. I think the two big challenges really are land and logistics. So we've sort of tackled some of the infrastructure related issues. I think we're doing a great job on the labor side. Land really remains an issue. And, in what was put together by your team, this issue came up about industrial parks and industrial zones. And I think at the end of the day, India will have to focus on these. The good news is that the Department of Industry is taking this very seriously. And I want to make one point in closing, which is manufacturing takes place at a particular location. And the public inputs that go into making sure that that location is a good one requires central government agencies, state government agencies, and local government agencies to be working well together. I think what we see in the Chinese cases, they have it relatively easy because of their institutional setup where city mayors are so powerful. Now, we don't have that same institutional setup, but we do have certain experiments going on in India. And in particular, I'm thinking about the Special Investment Region Act in Gujarat. I'm thinking about Andhra Pradesh's Industrial Area Local Authority Act. Now, these are really the type of institutional reforms we need, where industrial development and urban development agencies work together. Let me stop with that. I'm sure we'll come back to these issues in due course.
Okay, Rana, that's a very great handover. Why don't I start that as my first question? Repeatedly, we have seen people pointing out that China has been able to succeed because of these SEZs. And as you say, land, labor, these laws differ with state governments. The eagerness of execution changes depending on changing government. So, Dr. Subramanian, that question to you. This SEZ or industrial parks as a suggestion keeps coming. Is that something the government looks at seriously from the government's vantage point of view? Is that a good idea? And is it something that we will see happen?
That's a good question, Lata. Let me just add a couple of more points to what my esteemed panelists have said. I think one key sector, and this is something that we had written about in the last year's economic survey, which is assemble in India. Assemble in India for the world. The chapter on network products. If you and you know we had analyzed not only China but every country that actually had a very large export share, and Japan and China are actually sort of good examples of that. Typically, these countries start with start with assembling and then migrate on to more value added. If you look at the automobile sector in India as well, Maruti initially just assembled, and then the entire auto ancillary sector has taken over. Similarly, now we'll see with electronics as well. And this is where I think it's important. When I look at discussions relating to tariffs, I see a more broad brushed kind of discussion on tariffs. I think it's important to unpack that and look at the value chain of tariffs. Tariffs on finished goods versus those on raw materials and intermediates are completely different. I think, and by actually, especially us commentators, by painting them all with the same broad brush, I don't think we end up doing a good service to this particular cause. So if we have to focus on assembling, in some sense, first learning to walk in some areas before we run, I think the tariffs have to be tailored in a similar manner, because the potential there, especially with network products, global value chains, is about 4 crore jobs by 2025-26 and 8 crore. That's actually 40 million and 80 million respectively by 2030. So that's point number one. Second, I wanted to also bring about, if you look at the reforms that have been done and the budget infrastructure, logistics was mentioned by Gautam, and I want to actually talk about the 3 key areas where capex is focused on, is in power, roads and railways, and these 3 are extremely important for manufacturing, because roads and railways actually matter for logistics costs, and power, of course, is an important cost of production, something that was, again, I think Rana mentioned about Vietnam having a competitive advantage. What I do want actually, and this is maybe my nature of being optimistic, but what may have happened in the last 10 years versus what can happen now, there's a big difference, because labor reforms actually, and some of these other reforms that we have had, were big problems that continue to hobble us in our push towards manufacturing. Now I think the potential is definitely there. So some of the statistics that from Nomura that you might have mentioned actually may have been from a time when these reforms did not happen. So the opportunities now are greater. Now your question on the SEZs, I think it keeps coming up again and again. It's something. What we have found is that the coastal economic zones actually, and then this agglomeration economies that Rana mentioned, I think that's an excellent point. Again, research also shows that agglomeration is very important, and proximity to ports, to ports is important. So while the SEZ model, India was a pioneer of that, but did not really benefit from it for various reasons, because it was not really used only for exports. It was also sort of oftentimes misused for domestic purposes, etc. But I think the tweaking that to focus on coastal zones and thereby bringing agglomeration economies is something that we are really, we think that is that is necessary, and and has been highlighted at the highest levels. So some of the policies that you are seeing actually are also are in those directions. So I think with that tweak, it is important to sort of also think about industrial corridors and link, for instance, even if something, let's say, gets manufactured in Uttar Pradesh or a Bihar, because the costs, let's say are lower, those can be freighted, let's say, to the zones that are there in the coastal areas. Last point, I think there is an opportunity that is opening up now because of COVID, because there is a demonstration effect. The fact that we are doing this conference actually sitting at different locations, same way, I think now it's possible that a factory could be set up, let's say in Darbhanga in Bihar, where labor costs are much lower, with the headquarters being, let's say, in Delhi or Mumbai, and factory, the foremen, etc., interacting like this, to be able to get that win-win. I think that's also something that we need to focus on. Overall, again, let me say, I think what may have happened in the last 1 decade is certainly not a predictor for what can happen for India going forward.
I take your point entirely, Dr. Subramanian. You're stepping into probably a very different world, and only on the issue of the digitization and the fact that we are meeting in this virtual room. I just wanted to say this is not part of our discussion, But digitalization is going to give India a lot of jobs. There's no denying. We were at the NASSCOM conference, CNBC TV 18 covered it. And what we heard was that while they expected digital jobs to rise from 4 million to 10 million by 2030, now the expectation is that it will happen by 2024. In 3-4 years, the doubling of jobs from 4 to about 10 million or 4 to at least 8 million is going to happen in half the time than was initially thought. But anyway, that's
the point that I just wanted to add to that, Lata. Actually, what I was trying to say is that digitization can actually also enable manufacturing jobs itself by being able to actually for those jobs to come up in labor areas where labor is cheaper.
Yeah, I think I went off on a tangent, but I wanted to simply add one more question, Dr. Subramanian. Is there the SEZ policy or the approach to SEZ is being tweaked? Is there a land acquisition issue that bogged it earlier? In any way, should we see some improvements or focus, as Gautam said?
See, the land acquisition is an issue that I think hobbles, if you look at factors of production on labor, now I think we've had significant traction. On some of the, logistics, I think we've now taken care of. The effect will take some time to show up. I think maybe a year and a half. Power is also something that we're really sort of taking on, and working on. Land is one thing that remains. And I think that's one area where we still need some reforms, SEZ or otherwise. That's an area that certainly needs some work. And I think that's where maybe it may be useful, and given some of our sort of experience with legislation in this, states might actually possibly, my view, that states might be better, to go ahead and implement some of these reforms, because that will sort of complete the suite. You have labor, power, logistics, and you do land, then actually I think the entire portfolio of factors of production that you need for manufacturing, I think so the issue that has hobbled SEZs though is not as much about land per se, as it is of oftentimes misuse of the SEZs for domestic manufacturing, and the related to that also is, given the success of China and some of the other countries with coastal economic zones, I think tweaking SEZ to convert it into a coastal economic zone, and I think connecting it with industrial corridors might be the way to go.
Well, actually, the government is proceeding fairly rapidly with the dedicated freight corridor. So, what you say about in Darbhanga and exporting out of Calcutta or Surat or Mundra or JNPT may be very feasible. But let me take the other issue that you spoke about. We have this broad brush on tariffs, and you correctly pointed out that in certain cases, inputs have to be made cheaper. In certain cases, tariffs may have to be raised to give a nascent industry protection. Gautam, you also referred to it. So do you think there is enough, the conversation between government and industry, and are these finer points, sector-specific issues getting ironed out adequately?
So I think if I can add, I think the point is well taken. I think we have to look at one of the key issues is on the tariff thing is not the gross tariff, but I think the inverted tariff structure. So if you look at, I think turbines and certain kind of turbines, for example, you can import them at a rate that is lower than the underlying steel alloy. I think the steel alloy has a higher import tax structure. So I think some of those anomalies need to be fixed. But I think I would just put this in the context of all the factor costs that go into making competitiveness. If there's one more that I can add, I think, and Dr. Subramanian talked about land, labor, power, I would add one more, which is, I think, capital and interest cost. If you benchmark, while we are all living in the regime of low interest rates, in reality, if you benchmark India with a market like China, there is a real rate interest difference of about 4 to 5 percentage points. And that's a huge thing, particularly in capital intensive sectors, which is part of the reason why India has struggled to compete in capital intensive sectors. And I think if you look underneath that, why is there such a 4 to 5 percentage real interest rate difference between India and China? It comes from three things. One has to do with, I think, high operating costs of the banks in India. So the big reforms around privatization of some of the public sector banks and so forth, I think, are going to be critical. 1/3 of the difference is because of the NPA overhang. And I think some of the bad bank regulation and strengthening of the IBC will play a big role there. So I think some of those big reforms I actually think are critical to get executed, because over time, they will also bring cost of credit down. And the last thing I would say, it's cost and availability of credit. It's one of the reasons, by the way, why a lot of these small companies remain small and not scale is actually lack of access to competitive credit. So I would just add that to the tariff discussion. I think it's really a holistic, all factors to make us competitive.
I would caution you against raising credit as an issue, because it's quite possible that Dr. Subramanian and I will hijack it and we can talk for 24 hours on it. The MBA issue, I think his PhD work is on DRTs, right? Or was it SARFACI? So, let's not get there, but I think the government is working on all fronts with the IBC. And State Bank of India's results are indicating that clearly NPA is a legacy problem and balance sheets have adequately been cleaned up. Hopefully from April 1st, the NCLTs will start working again and the IBC will be up and running. And we should be able to clear whatever is left of the NPA backlog. But Gautam Kumra, I wanted the other question answered. Subramanian is very correctly pointing out that we should not have a blanket view to tariffs, and you said the same thing. Do you think it's being correctly addressed, or is more industry government cooperation needed to iron out? In certain cases, it's inverted. In certain cases, it is necessary for protection. So we can't talk broad brush. Is that happening? Or would you like more of
Look, again, I'm not personally, I may maybe not the best person to comment on the extent to which those dialogues are happening, because I'm not part of those. But the only thing I'd say is it has to be on the back of those global value chains. I would underscore that point, because in fact, we recently published a paper on McKinsey.com. We articulated about 11 value chains, right, that we think have the potential to drive all of this up. And I think the thing I would say is we have to look at each one of them. So auto component value chain, you have to look at end to end. Food processing value chain, end to end. Semiconductor value chain, end to end. Some are highly capital intensive, right? Take semiconductors, it's highly capital intensive. For every $1 billion you spend, you're going to produce $300 million in revenues. Other extreme is auto components. India has a real advantage. We have the ecosystem. We really have competitiveness in that value chain. So you have to go each global value chain at a time and see what would it take for us to really get a fair share of the global exports. And the last thing I would say is we also have to take an angle. We've talked a lot about export, but I would also put on the table import substitution opportunities. I would also put on the table domestic growth opportunities, and finally contract manufacturing opportunities. So we have to look at all four.
No, I take your point that there is not just export, but a domestic opportunity of import substitution. In fact, I was just looking at the January trade data, which we reported only a couple of days back. Imports, which were languishing for the past 9 months, they were contracting. And come January, we are seeing them expand. Guess where did they expand maximum? Electronics. So clearly people want to consume things which are not made in India, and there is a lot of import substitution that can be available. On that issue, Vani Kola, do you think the startups, the category you work with, will be able to contribute? I mean, is there any of these high-tech or consumer electronics industries or robotics, whichever, you tell us, where the government can pay attention and satisfy the Indian consumer need domestically rather than looking out? I think you unmute yourself.
How many times do we say that to each other in a call, huh? But one thing I'll tell you from the last decade of my deep involvement in the Indian startup ecosystem, when it comes to topics like FDI, tax, and tariff, clarity and consistency is really, really important. And that holds back global capital. And if we look at the inflow of global capital, I think a lot more could be done from in attracting it to many of these value chains. And then the investment from risk capital from people like us can only go with that. But if I look at, for a moment, taking stock, we have abundance of resources and workforce. I mean, we produce significant amount of iron ore, aluminum, all the basic raw materials from India. We have many natural resource advantages. And not sure if this is a good bad point, but India's minimum wage from contract worker is $148 per month. In China is 240 or something. And so, we have some advantages in terms of soft power as well, right? Now, if I think about from a investment perspective, I think there is one point, even when we talk about value chains or whatever, that we miss. You can take like a telecom manufacturing value chain, or you can take automotive value chain, but it is not simply about jobs in manufacturing. We now have to talk about skilled versus unskilled. You mentioned robotics. Manufacturing is going big way in that way. And so if you want to capture that from a global economic viability, you have to create skilled workforce that's able to do the value add to manufacturing. And I think that's very, very important. And the public-private partnerships are important. These are areas where people like us can hopefully contribute also. But factory automation, smart mechatronics, industrial robotics, these are here. We can't change that. Manufacturing can go happen in Germany if it is fully automatized, right? From a robotics perspective, the very reason why it moved offshore, could also have reverse trending with technology, which is important. Hence, I think India has to capitalize on its knowledge economy. I understand about land, port, and all that, but that's something the government will solve or has to solve. People like us can't solve it. But what has to happen is we increase, in order to create these 19 million or 40 million jobs, we have to work on looking at another level of what is skilled manufacturing in the next decade. How do we compete for what is going to be the next decade or 2 decades, not what was the last 2 decades. It's going to be different.
But does this high knowledge economy really need help? I mean, the 90s, the infotech industry grew without government help. And it looks like the current digitalization wave, as Rajesh Gopinathan said, we are standing at the start of a multi-year growth. Do you really need any help? It's growing anyways, isn't it?
Help doesn't necessarily mean, help means focus. Help doesn't necessarily mean you need to give a tax rebate or a PLI or whatever. I'm not even talking at that level. I mean, we are talking about what can we do as a country to focus, right? And, I like what Gautam said about finding some niches, where is it that we want to ace, whether you call it electronics, then you need to, sort of say my fab, my semiconductor, if you say something else. So, it is about bringing that focus and, bringing this, if we want to assemble in India, manufacture in India, whatever it is, but being able to bring those value chain linkages, we do need to have a more holistic view of that, right? And I do think that the skills economy, however we encourage it, will have to happen. For example, if I know that there is a certain value chain that the government is going to get involved, central, state, local, whatever, then we could create an investment thesis around that and say, oh, well, this there is ancillaries of these that we can help develop or invest or grow.
I get your point. I get your point, Vani. I get your point. Okay, now I just have one more macro question before I come to the specific area of apparels and footwear that Rana and Gautam already raised. The point I want to make is our labor not skilled enough? This is a common refrain I hear from several economists and even people like McKinsey, that India has the largest labor force or comparable to China, but it is not skilled. Now, would you do that? Is there any Vietnam seen as more skilled labor force and hence getting some of the high-tech investments that's leaving China? Is that a refrain you hear, and any answers for that?
Lata, I'm not sure who you're asking this to, but anyways, I'm going to jump in. I don't actually think that the skills issue is really all that big a deal. I don't see this as a binding constraint. India is a very large country. India has a very large workforce. There are enough skilled people at every level. You take apparel, whether you're talking about a sewing machine operator, these are people who can be trained 3 to 4 weeks by a firm. Or you're talking about even the industrial engineers who put together these plants. After all, our industrial engineers are in fact going and setting up textile and apparel plants in other countries. So I don't see it in apparel. Yes, there may be certain areas in electronics as get.
I was not referring to apparel. I said I'll come to apparel and textiles later. They're not high skilled.
Even so, Lata, I just don't think skills is really that binding constraint. There are enough engineers across the board. I mean, just look at what's happening in Bangalore. Look at what happens in Gurgaon. To think that India somehow has the skills that's required to making some breakthrough apps and doing all this fantastic work in IT, but somehow doesn't have it to assemble electronics. I just don't buy that skills argument. This is not to say, the question is the role of the public sector. I do see an important role for making sure, that the TVET system is working, that, secondary schools learning outcomes are improving, that the universities are getting better and better. But I think in terms of the numbers, we have it. This is a more medium-term, long-term issue. I don't think it's something that prevents us right now. Right now, it is these other issues we've been talking about.
All right.
Lata, can I just add?
Yeah, please go ahead. Dr. Subramanian, in fact, I wanted to toss it to you. I heard it from several quarters that Vietnam and China have a more skilled labor force than India. India has a large labor force, but not necessarily a large skilled labor force. Your thoughts, Dr. Subramanian?
Actually, I agree with Rana's assessment on this. And I want to make a broader point and use this platform to really appeal to, people like Vani and others in the startup ecosystem. If you take two markets broadly, labor markets and credit markets, by far the market failures, in a term that we economists use, are actually significant in both these markets. Let me give you an example. There are capable people, skilled people who may be, in Orissa, in Bihar, and yet you have people, employers looking for such skilled people, in a Gujarat, in a Maharashtra, right? So the markets basically are not coming together, right? Similarly, there's a problem on the credit side as well. One of the key things I want to actually highlight to venture capitalists like Vani is that they need to be looking for and encouraging startups that really fix these market failures. What we really need is, and I think that prism is important. I mean, and having done some research here myself, oftentimes venture capitalists wait for the kind of startup companies that come to them. But it's important for them to let the word out there that, these market failures, for instance, if a startup that actually can bring together the demand and supply, stuff like that, I think that prism of market failures is extremely important to solve these problems.
I have some good news for you. This is being tackled lately in two ways. There are large companies which have a large number of workers in their workforce, like TeamLease and like Questcorp, who are able to offer employees to those who are looking for employers, staffing companies basically. And there are apps, and I can mention two of them. There's workindia.in and asanjobs.com, which are available in about 15 to 17 languages. And people I have offered that app to several people who work in my ambience, and they have been able to find jobs in their locality. A pune job or a delivery boy. It started off, I'm not saying it's sizable enough. You haven't even noticed it, so clearly it's not that large. But a big thing has been made. Audience questions are likely to come anytime now. Gopal is warning me. So I want to quickly get one question in. You spoke about footwear and apparel, and I have the numbers there. This I'm quoting from Arvind Subramanian and Soumitra Chaudhary's paper, but I don't know the original source. Footwear, China's loss was 7.5% in the last 5 years. That has gone 5.9% of, this is global percentage of global GDP, has gone to Vietnam. 1.4 went to Germany. India got 0.1% of footwear that left China. Apparel, 5.8% of total footwear made in the world left from China, and 2.9% went to Vietnam, 2.8% went to Bangladesh, and only 0.2% came to India. So, low skilled labor, which India has, and low skilled jobs, which are required in textile and footwear, is not coming to India. Any guesses for that? India has about 25% of low skilled labor, but gets only about 7% of these kinds of jobs. There is a 15 percentage point gap between availability of that kind of labor and actually jobs that have come to India. So anything we can do to encourage low-skilled sectors like, textiles and apparel and furniture. Dr. Subramanian, question to you.
I think this is, a good point, because I feel this is more of a mindset aspect, right? When I mention about assemble in India, the point that I'm trying to say is, there is oftentimes this perception that higher value added sectors are actually better sectors to be in. If you're just assembling, those are not good enough. But the jobs that they create as well, they do create organized sector jobs. And I think at the macroeconomic level, there is no more important priority than job creation in the organized sector. So I think it's, we have to actually look at sectors like these, which actually can create lots of jobs. And, maybe the value added is not that large, but when you do it at large scale, for instance, to give you, and this is an example that we had covered in the, in the economic survey, if you take the Apple phone, right, the actual, value added per phone that China generates is about, I think, $8, while, US and Japan have about more than $50. But at least till a couple of years back, that $5 or so actually came across every phone that was being sold in the world. So, large scale multiplied by small value added still can, on a per unit basis translates into large value added. I think that mindset is really important. Another point which I think I must mention actually is that, and people who, and especially students, at universities like Harvard and others need to, play the role as well. That, in the last few years, I think India has done a lot of reforms on these counts, and the investors need to know about it. So that, the message needs to go that India is really serious about, about attracting these. And the focus also needs to be not just on the couple of things that are maybe not yet there versus those tens of things that have actually been done. I think that is also important in in creating the narrative.
Okay. Well, media companies have a role there, we are doing it. Okay, now I'm going to start with questions which are coming from the house, which Gopal and his team are messaging me. Well, this one says, does the private sector see gaps between policy making at the central level versus implementation of these policies at the state level? What needs to improve here? Gautam, you want to take this?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
look,
go ahead.
I mean, it's a very broad question. I think, look, in many cases, I think execution is where we falter. I think we all recognize that the cost of doing business and ease of doing business has really been one of the big challenges in making us competitive on the ground. And I think the point that Rana made, I think that the coordination that often needs to occur between central policy, state policy, and local administrators is really where things do break down. And I think some of the topics we talked about are not central issues, they are actually state issues. So I do think that is the holy grail. I think, and frankly, I personally think that a lot of progressive thinking and plans are coming out. I think, and a lot of it now relies actually on effective and speedy implementation.
Okay. No, you're right, actually. Power, for instance, and I think the companies, decrease their debt, pay on time, make state governments pay their dues on time to the distribution companies. You're right that the center is doing, but it's not always that states are able to oblige. Rana, there is another question that's coming up. After all this discussion of manufacturing, we must acknowledge that India has been a service-dominated sector. Is there scope for an Indian model that doesn't rely on massive manufacturing sector and instead has a relatively large service sector? Okay, I don't think this is Rana's question. This is more Dr. Subramanian's question. Dr. Subramanian, maybe you're barking up the wrong tree. This person is asking whether we should, services is our strength. Why not have an Indian model of growth?
I think, there is merit to this question, to this thought. But having contemplated it and having researched it, I would say that especially for such a large demographic, that demography that we have, and the jobs that we need to create, I think the manufacturing sector is extremely important. We don't need to think about manufacturing and services as substitutes. In many areas, actually, manufacturing and services are complements. Our strengths in services can actually be enabled to grow manufacturing significantly. In fact, when you look at some companies, do you want to actually categorize them as manufacturing or services? I think you may sometimes find it difficult because they may be, straddling both areas. So I think from a policy perspective, we basically need to think about them as complements, and at the same time also acknowledge that for such a large population to create jobs, and good jobs, high-paying jobs, I think manufacturing is absolutely important. We cannot do without it.
You're on mute.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Hear me? Okay. Well, this is a slightly long question. I don't know. Again, this looks like it would be Gautam or Dr. Subramanian's question. There can be a dichotomy between increasing high-value manufacturing, which creates fewer jobs, and creating more low-value-added jobs, which are labor-intensive, and they create more jobs. Are existing public sector policies and the private sector role sufficient to rapidly grow labor-intensive manufacturing? Very much my question, Gautam.
Well, I think we need to look at all three. I think there's labor intensive, there's skill intensive, and there's technology intensive. And I think, and I don't think, for to Dr. Subramanian's point, I think a country of our scale and our ambition, I think if we have to produce 1/5 of our GDP, I think we need to look at all. I think look at auto components. That's typically labor. I mean, that's typically skill intensive, right? And we have a big edge there. We need to scale that. I give an example of labor intensive. You talked about this earlier. I think a lot of it has to do with low labor productivity in India, but we can scale that if we pursue some of the labor reforms and drive automation and digital. And finally, look, we can't be just doing stuff that everyone has done. We have to look ahead. I think if India has to be self-reliant, you have to look at some of the new emerging technology areas, whether it's semiconductors or fabs. Now, that's technology intensive. So I think for a nation of our size and ambition, we need to look at all three.
And Lata, if I may add my color to it, I actually think about these as different stages, as I was mentioning earlier as well. You need to sort of learn to walk before you run. So doing some of the less value-added manufacturing is necessary oftentimes to actually migrate into. And if you look at Japan, you look at China, you look at many of these export-oriented countries, they started that way, actually doing the less value-added manufacturing and then migrating into higher value-added manufacturing. So that I think that dynamics is important to keep in mind. Another point, and just broadly, because this has come up a couple of times about public sector, I think there is a seminal change that is on now in India. I think, and last week, the Honorable Prime Minister talked about this in the floor of Parliament, talking about wealth creation and private sector. I think, in some sense, for a country where the remnants of socialism still remain, and where this jibes like the Soot Boot Ki Sarkar have been made, I was really glad to actually hear that. I think it could possibly be, as Business Line actually headlined their editorial the next day, they called it actually the watershed moment. I agree with that. So I think the productivity improvements that can come with this change, because it's a change in the political economy. Remember, this is not a change just in the economy, but in the political economy, and something that I think also can really help going forward.
1 minute. I think now you'll have to restrict your questions to answers to 1 minute, because we have last 5 minutes and questions are just pouring in. Rana, there's someone who's asking you, to your point about there not being any skills gap in India, isn't Vietnam recognized as having a relatively better primary education system, and solid primary education is necessary even for low skill industries? Are we lacking here? The person is specifically asking you, Ram.
Sure, Lata, my point is not that skills don't matter. It's just that India has sufficient number of skilled workers. In fact, specifically in low value added manufacturing or services. I mean, let me tell you something that Nick Bloom at Stanford had told me about skills. The whole point is that a well-managed company knows how to train workers. I have been to a factory that relocated from China, and what was fascinating was to see exactly Nick Bloom's point. The sewing machine operators were in a line, and they had photographs. They had photographs of what is a right stitch, what is a wrong stitch. I don't think that the skills issue really is I think made too much of. It's not a binding constraint. These other issues are land and the business environment locally. On that, what I want to say is that actually the Indian government is doing something very nice, and it's not recognized enough, and that is the industrial parks. So the industrial parks, there are about 3,000 state industrial development corporations at these parks. The central government is actually taking these, and it's developed a rating system. In fact, ADB has been involved in this exercise where we are coming in and rating these parks. And this is very transparent. This is up on the web. If you are actually somebody who wants to set up a plant, you want to know how much land there is, what types of infrastructure is there, what type of governance mechanism is existing in the park, you can actually go to this database and look. So, these are the kinds of reforms that are taking place. And here I completely agree with Dr. Subramanian that the kinds of things we have seen happening in the last 5-10 years, you're really going to see effects in the next 10 years. I really want to make one point on tariffs, Lata, but hopefully you can allow me to make that, because I think that's a very important point that needs to come in, and it ties up to what's wrong with the Indian apparel.
30 seconds, please go ahead.
Okay, so on apparel, I think we've done quite a bit removing a number of constraints. The tariff rates, this has come up. Gautam brought it up. It's come up in the newspapers. Different people. Professor Panagari has brought it up. I think it's a very important point. It's the one area where I think we need to be very careful. We are seeing some of these tariff increases, and this is a bit tricky. I completely understand that the point of this exercise is to give some temporary protection. The difficulty is when you start having these very different tariff rates, you actually sort of encourage this lobbying behavior by firms. I think we need to stop that. And coming to apparel, why does this tie into apparel? If you look at apparel, the one big problem India has is really on synthetics. We're very competitive on cotton. The problem is synthetics. Going forward, there's going to be a bigger and bigger problem if we don't get the price of synthetics down. But we have seen in the past how the biggest anti-dumping duties that have come in are basically on the import of synthetic fiber. And this is an example of where a trade regime, you can have protection at higher levels, but one which is not distorting between different types of inputs and outputs is quite important. Thank you.
I believe the government has already been apprised of it, and man-made fiber, as they call it, they are looking, I believe, to reduce input tariffs on that. Vani, I'm giving you 1 minute because you haven't participated. Anything that you want to add?
No, I kind of really believe that we have to develop specialized skilled economy. And that is important, at least from my perspective, for us to be able to participate at a higher level of the value chain. It's not that it's not trainable. It is just that, there is a vast ocean. And, and again, this is not even maybe perhaps about the, public sector or government policies. It's, again, goes back to me, at least on, areas of concentrated focus that can have value linkages down, through which we can make small changes from our small roles, from investing to promote. So at the capital value chain also. So, if we know we want to be the apparel value chain, let us say, and the government puts a focus on that and all the programs around it, then I think the capital involvement in that is areas where we can be involved, and we don't have that kind of a deliberate, concentrated focus today.
Got that. Well, I'm not taking the 1 minute that was assigned to me because I want Gopal to speak. I guess he wants to. I think one common theme that's coming from all the participants is that give us focus areas, as Gautam says, and as Vani is also saying, to identify then the private capital can get businesses arranged around government. Tell us what's your focus area. And I think the PLI schemes are a step in that direction. And finally, as Dr. Subramanian is saying, the government is already apprised of how specific sectors need different, you need higher tariffs in some and lower tariffs in others, where you need inputs, you need higher tariffs where you want to protect local industry. So I think there is a meeting of minds over here already. Over to you, Gopal. And thank you very much, participants. I enjoyed every moment of this.
Thank you so much, Lataji, for steering such a dynamic discussion. We've actually, throughout this session, we've been flooded with messages from the audience expressing their appreciation. So in addition to the audience, on behalf of the entire India conference team, please allow me to express our heartfelt gratitude to all our esteemed panelists and to our rockstar moderator as well. And of course, our sincere thanks to our audience spanning India, the US, and elsewhere across the planet. Thank you for tuning in and participating so actively through your thought-provoking questions. Finally, as a quick reminder to everyone, the next session of the conference is the Chief Minister's Roundtable featuring Hemant Sorenji, the Chief Minister of Jharkhand. The session is at 10 p.m. India time, 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. Please do visit the conference website, india-conference.com, for the Zoom link. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Subramanian, Gautam, and
Thank you, Lata, and to the
Thank you all.
panelists. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
for that. Very well
Thank you
done.
all.
It was very
Thank
good.
you.